In the previous episode of Forgotten Architectural History, we looked at the English Quarter in Oslo, a historic building complex demolished in the 1960s to make way for the brutalist-style Index House. While that was the story of a lost landmark that became a martyr for the historic preservation movement, there is a neighboring building that was saved, a holdout whose steadfast owner refused to sell and which public authorities made an exception for in the area's redevelopment plan. Take a look at this photo from 1965. At that time, the new Index House was partly completed, and the old English Quarter was partly demolished. But on the right, where I've added an arrow, there's an older building that looks as if it's going to be swallowed by the new concrete development. Here's another photo from 1973, after the Index House was completed, and that older building was still there. And it's still there today, 50 years later. How and why did this building survive when the English Quarter fell? That's what we're going to uncover in this episode. You don't need to watch the English Quarter episode to follow what's going on here, but there's a link in the description below in case you want to check it out. When a consortium of Norwegian industry groups announced plans in 1958 for a new development that would replace the English Quarter, it soon became clear that the plan was to redevelop the entire block, which included several other buildings in addition to the English Quarter. The developers of the Index House owned some of the properties in the block and made generous offers to buy the remaining ones. Some sold, but a few held out and refused to sell. One of these was a restaurateur named Hans R. Larsen. He owned the building at Observatory Street number 2B, as in, to be or not to be, that is the question. Well, in his case, he unreservedly answered to be. Not only was Larsen the property owner, but he also had a restaurant on its ground floor called La Belle Sole, which is the name many people use for the entire building. La Belle Sole, meaning the beautiful sun in Italian, was not just any Oslo restaurant, and its owner was not just any businessman. And just as importantly, this was not just any building. First, let's talk about the building. It was completed in 1903 next door to the west end of the English Quarter. The owner and architect was Alf Reuben. Although he was not an especially prolific or prominent architect, in this case, Reuben made his mark. He designed Observatory Street 2B in the Art Nouveau style, more commonly known as Jugendstil in Northern Europe, which in those days was at the cutting edge of design. He teamed up with a young sculptor named Wilhelm Rasmussen, who designed the floral reliefs for the facade with a curvy aesthetic, which was then in vogue in Vienna and elsewhere on the continent. There are relatively few Art Nouveau buildings in Oslo, and this has long been considered one of the city's best examples. In fact, an architecture magazine in 1955 asserted that it was, quote, more typical of Art Nouveau than any other Norwegian building. That may be a bit of Oslo hyperbole. Ålesund, a city on Norway's west coast rebuilt following a 1905 fire almost entirely in Art Nouveau, has many stellar examples. Nevertheless, many experts seem to agree with a 1976 newspaper article which contended that La Belle Sole is, quote, one of the finest and most accomplished Art Nouveau houses in the capital. But what about that stubborn owner who refused to budge when the developers tried to buy his property? Hans R. Larsen was the longtime owner of the building, having opened a restaurant there called Studia in September 1923. Here's an article reporting on its opening. Studia was popular and also featured live entertainment. Here's an ad for a Swedish cabaret singer named Gustav von Andern, who performed there in 1931. I want to pause for a slight digression, but it's still related to architectural history. Von Andern wasn't only an internationally famous singer, he was also a practicing architect. Here's an ad for his architecture practice in a Stockholm newspaper. At the same time, we're listening to a recording he made in 1923 in the United States. Okay, now back to Hans R. Larsen and his Studia restaurant. He continued to operate it until he revamped the space and replaced Studia with La Belle Sole, which opened in 1949. From the name, one might imagine that it was Italian, but actually it served seafood, complete with an aquarium stocked with live fish. La Belle Sole is considered one of Oslo's first high-quality restaurants, and it soon gained an international reputation. For example, the American travel magazine Holiday called it Norway's top gourmet place. There was also a building modification implemented, probably around the same time that Studia was transformed into La Belle Sole. As shown in this photo, Studia had an entrance directly from the sidewalk, but that door was removed and Lars Hansen worked out an agreement in which La Belle Sole was accessed for the neighboring building that was part of the English Quarter. And it wasn't only the entrance. La Belle Sole's bar and cloakroom were also, officially, on English Quarter property leased by Hansen. This may not seem like a big deal, but this arrangement later nearly doomed Larsen's business. When plans were announced in 1958 to replace the English Quarter with the Index House, the project's developers only owned some of the English Quarter buildings. However, they wanted to redevelop the entire English Quarter and acquire the rest of the properties on the block, including La Belle Soleil. Larson and a few of the other property owners opposed the project and refused to sell. A 1960 newspaper article reported that the restaurateur refused to sell at any price and quoted him as saying he had not built and maintained his house for almost 40 years for it to be demolished in favor of speculators and an annoying tall building. By the way, they wrote that with 2 exclamation points. The city of Oslo, supportive of the effort to bring a modern high-rise development to the site, agreed in 1961 to use the power of expropriation to take the properties of those owners unwilling to sell. But the city made one exception. Hansen's building was allowed to stay. La Belle Soleil, the building, was saved, but not necessarily its namesake. As I mentioned, La Belle Soleil, the restaurant, had its entrance, bar, and cloakroom in a neighboring English Quarter building. With that building being demolished, beginning in early 1962, Larson faced a new threat. He wanted to retain his right to lease that same space in the new Index House, but the developers said that Larson's lease was voided. They undoubtedly had no love for Larson, given his criticism of their project and refusal to sell, which altered their project design. Larson challenged them in court but lost his case. It looked bleak for Larson, like he would have a Pyrrhic victory. He had his building, after passing up a high-price offer, and now, seemingly out of spite, his business would be decapitated by the neighbor he spurned. He had one last hope: to receive permission from the city to modify his property. Let's take another look at one of the historic photos. On the right-hand side of the building's facade, it had a portal. Based on historic information, this provided access to a rear courtyard, parking, and stairs used to reach the upper floors of the building. Larson applied for permission to construct a new building extension in the courtyard for a new bar and cloakroom so that his restaurant wouldn't lose any space. The city's planning office recommended that the application be denied because it would eliminate parking. This was the early 1960s, and even in progressive Scandinavia, parking was a priority. The city planning manager, who opposed the application, acknowledged, quote, "If the restaurant will have to make such significant restrictions on its room to provide space for the bar and cloakroom, this means a serious reduction in capacity." As a newspaper reported in March 1962, La Belle Soleil was now fighting for its existence. Unexpectedly, the City Planning Council went against the staff recommendation and voted to approve Larson's application. For a second time, Larson's persistence, combined with a lifeline from the city, had rescued this building and its famed restaurant. A month later, La Belle Soleil closed temporarily for modifications, but it reopened in November 1963, 40 years after Larson opened his original restaurant, Studia, in the same building. As the article shown here reported, restaurateur Hans R. Larson did not give up. Yesterday he reopened La Belle Soleil. In the years since, he has remained a folk hero among historic preservationists, restaurateurs, and journalists who periodically retell his saga. His story even made it into a 1966 English travel guide written by Charles Graves, who hailed La Belle Soleil as, quote, "a monument to the little man's triumph over the authorities." Larson continued running the business in his cherished building until he passed away in December 1969. La Belle Soleil, at least in name, continued to operate into the 2010s, although at some point it seems to have become more of a nightclub than a fine dining establishment. Looking back, we can understand Larson's motivations. He wanted to preserve what he loved. But why did the city twice make special exceptions for him, and only him? No one seems to know for certain, but architectural historian Lars Emil Hansen, no relation to Hans, suggests in a 2008 article that it may have been because the property was on a side street, the restaurant was very popular, and that authorities of those times had more appreciation for Art Nouveau architecture than historicist buildings like the English Quarter. Today, there's an interesting postscript to this story, which illustrates how sometimes history comes full circle. The real estate company that manages and partly owns Index House also controls La Belle Soleil. Last year, 2022, the firm announced that it was restoring the historic building and making it available as high-quality space for commercial leasing. The Index House website, shown here in its original Norwegian text, calls La Belle Soleil Jugendstilhuset, the Art Nouveau house. As of summer 2023, the building has been partly leased, and this page from the Index House website, translated into English, markets Hans Larsson's old building by emphasizing its architectural and historical character. However, The website omits the contentious history between the two buildings. La Belle Soleil and Index House, two buildings that once exemplified the conflict between tradition and modernity, are now joined under the same corporate umbrella. I wonder what Lars R. Hansen would think of this outcome. Thanks for watching. For more information, please see the description below. If you enjoyed this, please like, comment, and subscribe. You can also support this channel by making a contribution on Buy Me a Coffee. See the link in the description below. Ciao!